The mountains that kept a secret. There is a letter that does not survive, and a moment that almost no one recorded, and yet we can place both of them with strange precision. Picture a man climbing down out of the highlands of Ethiopia in the year 1773. His name is James Bruce. He is Scottish, he is exhausted, and he has spent something close to 6 years in a country the rest of Europe barely understood. He is carrying, among other things, 3 books. They are written in Ge'ez, an ancient African language that almost no scholar in London or Paris could read. The pages are illuminated, painted with care by hands that had been copying this same text generation after generation for centuries. And the title of those 3 books would have meant nothing to most educated Europeans of his day, because the educated Europeans of his day believed this particular book no longer existed. They believed it had been lost. Some of them believed it had been deliberately destroyed. The book was the Book of Enoch. And the question that should stop you, the question worth holding on to through everything that follows, is a simple one. How does a book vanish? Not a single copy, a book, an entire text, quoted by early Christians, woven into the New Testament itself, treasured and argued over by the sharpest minds of the early church. How does something like that simply disappear from the Western world? For more than 1,000 years, surviving only in the mountains of one isolated kingdom, until a Scottish traveller carries it back down out of the clouds. Here is what I find striking about Bruce. He did not stumble onto these manuscripts. He went looking. By the time he reached Ethiopia, it had been known in Europe for roughly 2 centuries that the full text was preserved somewhere in that country. Others had tried to acquire it, and others had failed. One respected scholar of the previous century, a man named Hiob Ludolf, perhaps the finest European expert on Ethiopia in his age, had examined a text claimed to be the Book of Enoch and dismissed it outright as a forgery. And that is worth pausing on. The greatest authority of his generation had looked at the possibility of this book and decided it was a fake, a thing not worth chasing. Europe had, in effect, closed the file. So, when Bruce came down from those highlands, he was not just carrying 3 old books. He was carrying the answer to a riddle that European scholarship had been chewing on, doubting, and finally giving up on for generations. And there is a quiet irony folded into that. The manuscripts Bruce carried were themselves not ancient. They were copies made in Ethiopia within the last few centuries before his arrival. The physical books in his hands were comparatively young, but the words inside them, the text those Ethiopian scribes had been faithfully reproducing, were old, almost beyond measure. That is the thing about a banned book that survives in only one place. The paper ages and is replaced. The story does not, it simply waits. The 3 copies scattered after that. One Bruce presented to King Louis XV in Paris for the Royal Library. A second went, a year later, to the Bodleian Library at Oxford. The third he kept for himself, and it joined the Bodleian collection after his death in 1794. 3 manuscripts, 3 doors suddenly unlocked into a story that had been sealed away. But to understand why anyone would want that story sealed, you have to meet the man at the center of it. Not James Bruce, the other man, the one the book is named for. In the 5th chapter of Genesis, there is a list. It is the kind of passage most readers skim, a genealogy, a chain of names and numbers running from Adam down toward Noah. So-and-so lived this many years, and fathered a son, and lived more years, and died, and died, and died. The chapter has a rhythm to it, and the rhythm is the rhythm of mortality. Every name ends the same way, every name but one. Enoch is the 7th generation counted from Adam. He is the son of a man named Jared. He becomes the father of Methuselah, the longest-lived figure in the entire Bible, when he is just 65 years old. And then Genesis tells us something it tells us about no one else in that chapter. It says, Enoch walked with God. It says it twice, as if the writer wanted to be sure we did not miss it. That phrase, walked with God, is handed to only one other human being in the whole stretch of years before the Great Flood, and that man is Noah. 2 names. Out of all of them, only 2 men described as walking with God. And then comes the part that has unsettled readers for thousands of years. The other patriarchs in that chapter lived enormous spans, 700 years, 800, 900. Enoch lived 365. A short life by the standards of his world. And his story does not close with the word that closes everyone else's. It does not say that Enoch died. It says instead that he was not, for God took him. He was not, for God took him. Sit with how strange that is. In a chapter built entirely around death, around the steady drumbeat of one man after another reaching his end, there is a single figure who simply stops appearing. No deathbed, no grave. A man who, the text insists, did not finish his life the way every other human being finishes it. He was walking, and then he was elsewhere, carried out of the world by something larger than the world. Genesis gives you almost nothing else. A handful of verses, and then the narrative moves on toward Noah and the rising tide of human wickedness. But that silence is exactly the point. Because the Book of Enoch, the book Bruce carried down the mountain, claims to be what fills that silence. It claims to be the testimony of that vanished man. It claims to record what Enoch saw when he walked with God, where he went when he was taken, and what he learned in the heavens that the rest of us were never meant to know. Now, the early church did not treat this lightly, and this is the detail I keep returning to. We sometimes imagine that a book like this lived only on the fringes, whispered about by cranks and outsiders. The opposite is true. The Book of Enoch was read seriously by some of the most formidable Christian thinkers of the first centuries. It is treated as scripture in an early Christian writing called the Epistle of Barnabas. Church fathers cited it. And most remarkable of all, the New Testament itself reaches back and quotes it. In the short letter known as the Epistle of Jude, the author names Enoch directly, the 7th from Adam, and repeats a prophecy that most modern scholars trace straight back to the Book of Enoch. Think about what that means. A book that would later be pushed out into the dark, treated as something dangerous, something apocryphal, was once close enough to the heart of the faith that it left its fingerprints inside the Bible that hundreds of millions of people still read today. The quotation is still there. You can open the New Testament and find it. The church kept the fingerprint and discarded the hand. So here is where this first chapter of our story has to leave you. Not with an answer, but with the shape of the mystery. We have a book that early Christians cherished, a book that the New Testament was willing to quote, a book attributed to the one man in Genesis who never tasted death. And we have the strange, undeniable fact that this same book was then allowed to fall away, to slip out of the Western world so completely that scholars assumed it gone. Until a man in 1773 went into the mountains of Ethiopia and brought it back. The way I read it, a book does not vanish by accident, not a book that important. Something has to push. Something has to decide that a particular story is better left untold, and then act on that decision, quietly, over generations, until the silence feels natural and no one remembers there was ever anything else. What the Book of Enoch actually contained, the secret that may have made it too dangerous to keep, is a story of 200 beings who looked down at the earth and chose to fall. It is a story of a mountain, an oath sworn in fear, and a kind of knowledge that humanity, in this telling, was never supposed to hold in its hands. That is the story the manuscripts had been guarding in the highlands all along. And it is the story we are about to open. There is a cold that lives at the top of a mountain, a cold that has nothing to do with the season. It is the cold of thin air and old stone, of a place high enough that the world below seems small and quiet and far away. Imagine standing on a summit like that, before dawn, the rock pale under your hands, the valley still dark beneath you. And imagine you are not alone. Imagine there are 200 others gathered there with you in the half-light, and that not one of them belongs in this world at all. This is the scene the Book of Enoch asks us to picture. Not a battlefield, not a city, a mountain. And on that mountain, a decision that the book insists changed everything that came afterward. The mountain has a name. It is Mount Hermon, and according to the text, 200 beings called the Watchers came down upon its summit. They were angels. Their assigned task, the duty they had been given, was exactly what their name suggests. They were meant to watch. To observe humanity from a distance, the way you might watch a fire without ever reaching into it. But the book tells us they did not keep that distance. They looked down at the human world, at the daughters of men, and what they felt was not detached observation, it was desire. And desire, in this telling, is where the fall begins. Now, here is a detail I think most retellings rush past, and it deserves to be slowed down. The leader of the 200, a figure the text names Semyaza, was afraid. Not of God's judgment exactly, he was afraid of being left holding the blame alone. He suspected that if they all agreed to descend, some of them would lose their nerve at the last moment and turn back, and that he, as the one who proposed it, would carry the full weight of the sin by himself. So he did something very human, something you would recognize from any conspiracy in any age. He made them all swear an oath. Every one of the 200 bound themselves with a curse, a mutual vow, so that no single one of them could walk away clean. They were in it together now, or not at all. And that oath, the book suggests, is woven into the very name of the place. Mount Hermon, the mountain of the binding. I want to stop on that for a moment because it is easy to hear all of this as old mythology and let it slide past. But notice the shape of it. A group of powerful figures gathered in secret in a high and hidden place. A leader who does not trust his own followers. A binding oath designed not out of loyalty but out of fear. Designed so that everyone is equally guilty and therefore no one can betray the rest. That is not the logic of myth. That is the logic of every cartel, every secret pact, every room where powerful people agree to do something they know they should not. The Book of Enoch, written more than 2,000 years ago, understood that logic perfectly. Whoever wrote this knew exactly how conspiracies hold themselves together. They hold together because everyone has already crossed the same line. So the Watchers descended. They took human wives, exactly as they had sworn to do, and from those unions came children. But the children were not human, and they were not angels. They were something the text calls the Nephilim. The Nephilim were giants. The book describes them as enormous, powerful, and ravenous, and the word ravenous matters here, because the giants needed to be fed, and the scale of their hunger was beyond anything human society could sustain. The book tells us they consumed the harvests, the herds, the labor of entire communities, devouring whatever men could produce. And then, when there was nothing left, when the fields were stripped and the people had nothing more to give, the giants, according to the text, turned on humanity itself. It is a horrifying image, and it is meant to be. A world being eaten from the inside by its own offspring, by a thing it had helped to create and could not control. But here is where the Book of Enoch becomes genuinely dangerous. And I mean dangerous in the way that ideas are dangerous. Because the giants are not actually the worst thing the Watchers brought down that mountain. The giants were a physical catastrophe, terrible but visible. The Watchers also brought something quieter, and the book treats it as the deeper crime. They brought knowledge. The Watchers, the text says, taught humanity things that humanity was never meant to know. One of them, the figure named Azazel, is said to have taught men how to forge weapons of war, how to work metal into blades and armor. Others revealed the secrets of sorcery, the reading of the stars, astrology, the mapping of the heavens, even, the book notes, the making of cosmetics, the arts of adornment and illusion, metallurgy, sorcery, astronomy, the technologies of violence and the technologies of deception handed down from the sky into human hands. And I want to be careful and precise here, because this is the heart of it. The Book of Enoch is not condemning knowledge itself. It is condemning knowledge that arrives too early, knowledge taken rather than earned, knowledge poured into the hands of people who have not yet built the wisdom to hold it. There is a difference, the text seems to say, between a discovery that a society grows into slowly and a power that is simply handed to it overnight by something stronger and older than itself. The first kind of knowledge a people can absorb. The second kind tends to absorb the people. That is a strikingly modern fear when you sit with it. The idea that the danger is not the thing you know, but the gap between what you can do and what you are ready to do. We have our own word for that gap now. We tend to call it technology outracing ethics. The Watchers, in this ancient story, are the first version of that warning. So consider where this leaves the world of the text. Humanity now has weapons it did not invent and cannot uninvent. It has been corrupted by knowledge it cannot return, and it is being physically devoured by a generation of giants it cannot kill. The earth, in the Book of Enoch, is not simply sinful, it is contaminated. It has been poisoned at the level of its bloodline and its mind. And this is the part that changes how you read the rest of the Bible. Because most of us were taught a simple version of the Great Flood. We were taught that the flood came because human beings were wicked, that it was a punishment for sin, a moral reckoning. But the Book of Enoch tells a different story, and it is a colder, stranger, more unsettling one. In Enoch's account, the flood is not only a punishment, it is a cleansing. It is, in a sense, a quarantine. The waters come to wipe out the corrupted bloodline of the Nephilim, to scour the earth of a contamination that could not be undone any other way. The flood is not God losing his temper. The flood is God containing an outbreak. The way I read this, that single shift, is the whole reason the Book of Enoch would later become a problem. Think about what it does. In the familiar version, evil is a human failure. We sinned. We earned the flood. The responsibility sits squarely on human shoulders, and that placement of responsibility is the foundation of an enormous amount of later theology. But Enoch's version moves the blame. In Enoch's version, the corruption of the world begins above it. It begins with rebellious angels making a choice on a mountaintop. Evil, in this telling, was introduced from outside, handed to humanity by beings who should have known better. That is a beautiful and terrifying piece of theology. And it is also, for an institution trying to build a clear and orderly account of sin and salvation, an extremely inconvenient one. The watchers are bound, the giants are loosed. The knowledge is already spreading from hand to hand, city to city, and it will not be called back. The man at the center of all this, Enoch himself, the one who walked with God, has not yet been asked to play his part, but he will be. The fallen angels, facing a judgment they cannot escape, will turn to the one human being who can carry a message between earth and heaven, and they will beg him to plead for them. What he saw when he answered them, and why the people who came after decided that what he saw was better left in the dark, is where this story turns next. How does a book become forbidden? Not burned in a single dramatic night, not banned by a single decree that everyone remembers. The truth is quieter than that, and slower, and in some ways more troubling. A book becomes forbidden the way a path through a forest disappears. No one announces that the path is closed, people simply stop walking it. The grass grows back, the branches lean in, and one day a traveller stands at the edge of the woods and cannot find the way at all, and assumes there was never a road there to begin with. That is, more or less, what happened to the Book of Enoch. And to understand it, we have to follow the story forward, out of the world of watchers and giants, into the very real world of the 3rd and 4th centuries, into the council chambers and the libraries of an institution that was changing faster than almost anyone living through it could see. For its first 200 or 300 years, Christianity was not an empire's religion. It was a scattered, often persecuted movement, a network of communities with no central authority strong enough to tell all of them what to read. And in that world, the Book of Enoch was not an outsider's text. It was read. It was respected. It was, in places, treated as scripture outright. An early Christian writing called the Epistle of Barnabas quotes Enoch as authoritative. Influential thinkers cited him. The most striking voice of all belongs to a man named Tertullian, writing around the year 200. Tertullian did not merely tolerate the Book of Enoch, he defended it. He built an argument that it was genuine, that it deserved to be treated as true prophetic scripture, and his reasoning was simple and hard to dismiss. The New Testament itself, in the Epistle of Jude, had quoted Enoch. If the Bible was willing to quote the book, who was Tertullian to reject it? Hold on to that argument, because it is about to be turned completely upside down. Because the church Tertullian belonged to was not going to stay the way he found it. Over the next century and a half, Christianity moved from the margins toward the center of power. It went from a hunted faith to the official religion of the Roman Empire. And an empire's religion needs something a scattered movement can do without. It needs a fixed list. It needs to be able to say, clearly and with authority, these books are scripture, and these books are not. It needs a canon. And the moment you start drawing that line, the moment you start deciding what is in and what is out, the Book of Enoch becomes a problem. Several problems, in fact, and I think it is worth laying them out honestly, because the real story here is more interesting than a simple tale of villains hiding the truth. The first problem was the content itself. Think about what the Book of Enoch actually asks a reader to believe. Angels with physical bodies, angels capable of desire, capable of lust, capable of looking at human women and wanting them. To the orthodox thinkers who are now trying to build a clean, coherent, defensible theology, this was deeply uncomfortable. Their picture of angels was moving toward pure spirit, beings of light and will, not creatures of flesh who could be tempted the way a man is tempted. Enoch's angels did not fit that picture. They were too physical, too fallible, too strange. The second problem was structural. The Book of Enoch is sprawling and visionary and wild. It does not move in the orderly way a foundational scripture was now expected to move. It is mystical, where the church wanted clarity, chaotic, where the church wanted system. It carries the reader up through layered heavens, past walls of crystal and rivers of fire, through visions that fold back on themselves and refuse to resolve into a clean lesson. For an institution trying to assemble a tidy library, a library it could teach from, defend, and hand down with confidence, Enoch was the book that would not sit straight on the shelf. It was too large for the space the church had decided scripture should occupy. But the third problem was the deepest, and the way I read it, it is the one that truly sealed the book's fate. Remember what we learned about Enoch's account of evil. In the Book of Enoch, the corruption of the world comes from above. It begins with the Watchers, with rebellious angels making a choice on a mountaintop and handing forbidden knowledge down to a humanity that had not asked for it. Evil, in that telling, is something done to humanity from outside. Now, set that beside the theology the church was building. At the center of that theology was an idea about human responsibility, an idea that the brokenness of the world traces back to a human choice, to human sin. The whole architecture of guilt and redemption rests on that foundation, and Enoch's story quietly undermines it. If evil entered the world because angels rebelled and gave us weapons and sorcery, then the weight on human shoulders is lighter. The burden shifts, and a theology built on the weight of human responsibility cannot easily make room for a book that lifts part of that weight away. I want to be careful here, because it would be easy and dramatic to say the church read the Book of Enoch, understood exactly how dangerous it was, and deliberately set out to destroy it. The evidence does not actually show that. There was no great organized campaign, no empire-wide order to hunt down and burn every copy. What the records show is something subtler and, honestly, more believable. The book was simply allowed to fall away, and we can watch it happen through the words of the men who shaped the canon. By the year 367, the powerful bishop Athanasius issued a famous letter listing the books that belonged to Scripture, and Enoch was not on it. A church council, the Council of Laodicea, meeting around the same years in the early 360s, is associated with the same exclusion. The great scholar Jerome labeled the book apocryphal, and Jerome recorded something revealing. He noted that because the Epistle of Jude had quoted from Enoch, many people now rejected Jude itself. Think about how completely the argument had reversed. Tertullian had said, "The Bible quotes Enoch, therefore trust Enoch." Now the same fact was being read the other way. Enoch is suspect, therefore be suspicious of anything that quotes it. The most honest voice of all belongs to Augustine, and his words are worth quoting closely because they are not the words of a man burning a book in rage. Augustine admitted there was likely some truth in these writings. He even acknowledged that Enoch, the ancient figure, had probably left some genuine divine writings behind. But, he concluded, those writings have no place in the canon of Scripture. His stated reason was not that the book was evil, it was that its chain of transmission could not be trusted. It was too old, passed down through too many uncertain hands, and there was no way to be sure the text had survived the centuries uncorrupted. So, it had to be set aside. That is how a book becomes forbidden. Not with fire, with a list it does not appear on, with a label, apocryphal, that quietly tells every future copyist and every future library that this one is optional, this one is doubtful, this one need not be preserved with the same care as the others, and once that judgment settles in, the rest is just time. Copies are not made. Old manuscripts are not replaced as they crumble. Within a few generations, the Greek text that the early church had read so widely had effectively vanished from the Christian world. Effectively, but not entirely, because there was one place the decree of Rome and the letters of Athanasius and the verdict of Augustine simply did not reach. Far to the south, in the highlands of Ethiopia, the Ethiopian Orthodox Church had received the Book of Enoch, and it had made a different choice. It kept the book. It treated it as scripture. It went on copying those pages in the Ge'ez language century after century, long after the rest of Christianity had let the path grow over. The leaders who drew the canon may have believed the story of the Watchers was finished, closed, safely set outside the walls. They controlled the lists, they controlled the libraries, they controlled, very nearly, the memory of an entire civilization. But a book that survives in even one mountain kingdom is a book that has not actually died. It has only gone quiet. And the desert, as it turned out, had been keeping its own copies all along. The desert that refused to forget. There is a stone that almost never got thrown. Picture a young Bedouin shepherd in the winter of 1947, walking along the dry cliffs that rise above the northwestern shore of the Dead Sea. His name was Mohammed Ed-Dhib. He was looking for a goat that had wandered off, the way shepherds in that country had been looking for stray goats for thousands of years. And on a whim, the way a bored teenager will, he picked up a rock and threw it into the dark mouth of a cave above him, expecting nothing. What he heard was not the sound of stone hitting stone. What he heard was the sound of pottery shattering. Now, imagine for a moment a version of this story where the stone never gets thrown, where the goat wanders home on its own, where Mohammed Ed-Dhib walks past that cliff and never looks up, and the jars sealed inside those caves remain sealed, the way they had remained sealed for almost 2,000 years. In that version of the story, the secret history of the Book of Enoch would have stayed buried in those jars. The thing we are about to talk about, the discovery that quietly demolished centuries of comfortable certainty about this banned book, would simply never have happened. The stone got thrown, so the story turns. The cave Mohammed Ed-Dhib stumbled onto is now known as Cave 1. It held 7 nearly intact scrolls, sealed inside tall clay jars, dry preserved by the brutal desert air. And within months, the world of biblical scholarship had felt a tremor it has never quite recovered from. These were the Dead Sea Scrolls. The library, or part of the library, of a Jewish community that had lived at a site called Qumran around the time of Jesus, and possibly earlier. The scrolls contained Hebrew and Aramaic copies of biblical texts that were 1,000 years older than any complete biblical manuscript anyone had ever held in their hands. But here is the thing about the discovery at Qumran that most retellings rush past. It did not end in 1947. It did not end with the 7 scrolls of Cave 1. Over the next 9 years, between 1947 and 1956, 11 different caves in those cliffs would give up their contents. And the cave that matters most for our story is the one labelled Cave 4. Cave 4 was found in 1952, 5 years after the first discovery, and it was found, fittingly, by Bedouin treasure hunters who had learned by then that there was real money in those jars. Cave 4 was the motherlode. It held the fragmented remains of roughly 600 different manuscripts, and among those fragments, in 11 separate copies written in Aramaic, were portions of the Book of Enoch. I want you to sit with what that means, because if you have followed the story this far, you understand exactly what just happened. For more than 1,000 years, the Christian West had treated the Book of Enoch as something marginal at best, an apocryphal curiosity, possibly a forgery, certainly not something serious people built their faith on. The respected scholars before James Bruce had assumed it was a late invention. Even the Ethiopian manuscripts Bruce had carried down from the mountains were only a few centuries old. There was always room in the back of a doubter's mind to say that perhaps the whole thing was a medieval fabrication that had drifted south into Africa from somewhere obscure. And then a goat wandered off, and a stone got thrown, and 5 years later a different cave gave up 11 Aramaic copies of the Book of Enoch, written more than 2,000 years ago on parchment that had been waiting in the dark since before the New Testament was even composed. Paleographers, the scholars who date ancient handwriting, examined the oldest of these Enoch fragments and concluded that they were written somewhere between 200 and 150 years before the Common Era. Which means the text those scribes were copying from was already old. The Book of Enoch, in some form, was already circulating among Jews in the 3rd century before Christ. This was not a medieval forgery. This was not a fringe text. This was a real, ancient, beating piece of Jewish religious imagination, read and copied carefully by the same kind of devout people who were also copying Genesis and Isaiah. The Watchers, the descent on Mount Hermon, the giants, the forbidden knowledge handed down from the sky, all of it was sitting in the same library as the scriptures that everyone, Jewish and Christian alike, considered foundational. Now, the honest scholar in me has to add one detail, because it complicates the picture. Not every section of the Book of Enoch was found at Qumran. The portion known as the Book of Parables did not appear among the Aramaic fragments, so the form of the book the Qumran community knew may not have been identical to the form Bruce carried out of Ethiopia centuries later. The book grew over time. But the earliest core, the Book of the Watchers, was unmistakably there, in Aramaic, in copies dating to a time when there were no Christians at all. The way I read this discovery, it forces a question that the institutional church spent 1,500 years not having to answer. If the Book of Enoch was already old, already revered, already woven into the religious imagination of the Jewish world in the centuries leading up to Jesus, then the people who actually walked the earth alongside him were reading it. The Galilean fishermen, the Pharisees, the writers of the New Testament, the figures who shaped the very first Christian communities. They knew this book. They quoted it. They lived inside its categories. And when the much later church declared that book apocryphal, suspicious, unsuitable for the canon, that later church was not simply rejecting a stray manuscript, it was redrawing the boundary of its own origins. It was deciding, retroactively, that a portion of the world its founders inhabited was no longer admissible. That is not a small thing. That is the kind of editing that changes what a tradition is allowed to remember about itself. And here is what strikes me, sitting with everything we have walked through across these 4 chapters. The story of the Book of Enoch is, in the end, a story about what survives. It is a story about how a powerful institution can succeed almost completely in burying an idea, can keep it out of its libraries, out of its sermons, out of the memory of an entire civilization for more than 1,000 years, and still fail. Because suppression depends on the assumption that you control all the corners. You do not. There is always a kingdom you have not conquered, a copy in a language you cannot read, a jar in a cliff you have never climbed. Somewhere far from the center, in the highlands of Ethiopia, a different church was quietly copying the pages and refusing to let the prophet die. And somewhere closer to the heart of the old world, in jars sealed inside cliffs above a salt sea, the original Aramaic words were waiting in the dark, more patient than any council or canon, waiting for a shepherd and a stone. The architects of the Western canon controlled the lists, they controlled the great libraries, they controlled very nearly everything, but they could not control a mountain kingdom they had never reached, and they could not control a desert that simply kept its own copies in silence until the world was ready to read them again. I will leave you with the question I cannot quite shake. If a book this important, a book that was once treated as scripture, a book quoted in the New Testament itself, could be pushed so completely into the dark for 1,500 years that even educated people forgot it had ever existed, then what else did they decide we were not supposed to see? What other voices from the early world were quietly left off the lists? What other manuscripts are still sitting in caves we have not yet found, in monasteries we have not yet visited, in libraries whose catalogues have not yet been read? History does not really teach us who was right and who was wrong. It teaches us, again and again, that the official version is only one version, that the canon is a curated room, and that outside its walls, the desert keeps its own records. Somewhere, even now, a jar is sitting in a cave that no one has walked into yet. A shelf of unread manuscripts is gathering dust in the monastery library no scholar has bothered to catalogue. A page in a language almost no one alive can read is waiting, the way Enoch's pages waited, the way the Aramaic fragments waited. Whatever those pages say, they will say it in their own time, on their own terms, without asking the permission of anyone who once thought the story was finished. The book was never really lost. It was only waiting for us to be willing to read it.